Okay, we've got our raw data transferred from our solution, from our Shakespeare Sonnets file, into our isolated storage XML quote-unquote database. Now we need to change the data models to be able to read and write that and create the things that we need to have for our pivot control. But before we get into that, let's take a brief look at what a pivot control needs in terms of data. So let's open up the main XAML, reformat, and what we're looking at here is the raw pivot data from the template, but it will give us a way of looking at what the structure of it is so we understand what we've got to do. So here we've got in our controls, we don't have a grid at the top with our name of our application and the title of the page. Instead, we use the pivot control. That's where the application goes, and there are two pivot items, one for each page. You obviously can have more than two, but for a pivot, you usually have at least two. So let's take a look at what's inside of a pivot item. Inside of a pivot item here, we have a list box. That doesn't have to be what's in every pivot, but that happens to be what we're doing because we want two lists, one for all sonnets and one for the favorite sonnets. Again, this list box, in this case, is bound to the items property of our main data model, and similar to the Windows data-bound application, that list box item template has a stack panel in it with line 1 and line 2. Now, if we go look at pivot item number 2 in the default text that comes out of the template, again, they're binding to the items collection in the main data model. When we look at our actual pivot control, you'll see we're going to be binding to a separate items collection. That way we get two different views over the top of the same data. Now let's go to the main view model and make some updates there. Let's take a look at what we did here. Again, we added some code to access isolated storage because here is where we're going to go load that sonnets with favorites.xml and also write it back when the user taps the star icon in the application bar. Because we now have two lists in our pivot, and we'll look at the actual structure of the pivot just before we run the final app, but we need two lists in our view model because we need one for the list box of all items and one for the list box of favorite items. So we create two item view model observable collections. We created an additional property in order to be able to retrieve those favorite items. This is all the same for the items property, but we also added a new property to go along with the iNotify property interface so that when we update the favorites, the list of favorites automatically gets updated. We saw that in the run-through of the app, that when we clicked on the star and then used the back key to go back to the list of favorites, it automatically was there. We didn't have to do any code in order to be able to get that favorites updated because of the Silverlight data binding. And now our load data is different because instead of loading from the Shakespeare Sonnets.xml, we're now going to load from our isolated storage file. So we do something sort of in reverse order for what we did for saving it. We go create an observable collection to get all of our sonnets. Once again, we go get user store for application to get access to the isolated storage for this app. And then we create an isolated storage file stream in order to read it. But in this case, we use open file and use file mode open. And then similarly, we create a stream reader instead of a stream writer, another serializer, and then we call deserialize to load the data in. Now, once we've done that, we now have this observable collection of item view models. And what we're going to do is go through and populate our two lists. Because remember, we have two lists of items in our view model. One is our main items list, and the other is just the list of sonnets that are favorites. So we basically add everything to the main items list and then look at the favorite flag as we're iterating over them to decide if it should be added to the favorites list. The reason this has the red squiggly underneath is because we haven't yet updated the item view model, which is the next thing we're going to do. So this will automatically resolve itself. And finally, we added two more methods here, which are called from the details page when the user taps the star icon to set a favorite or delete a favorite. So at that point, we'll see that when we look at the code for that, the user taps that, it comes back here to the main view model and says either add this particular item to favorites or remove it from favorites. And it simply uses the built-in collection mechanism to add or remove. And because when we loaded the data from the XML file, we took the same instance of the item view model and put it into both lists, we can use these methods. Because essentially, even though we might have a list of all items with all 154 sonnets in it and a list of favorite items with 3 sonnets in it, those lists are not two separate copies of, say, sonnet number 3. They both effectively point to the same instance of an item view model class that is sonnet number 3. Because we're implementing an instance of iNotify property change, we have to call notify property change to indicate that the favorites have changed, and that's how the list gets automatically updated. Finally, the very last method is how do we actually update the database when somebody makes a change. So the code in the details page, which we'll see in just a minute, that handles the tap on the star icon, calls one of those two methods to add or remove from the favorites list, and then calls update database. Now, update database is essentially the same as what we did in the main app constructor, with one caveat, which is that we delete the file first and then write it all over again. So we're not actually updating the XML file in place, we're simply writing it completely all over again. So while this is a reasonable thing to do for 154 Shakespeare sonnets, clearly this would not scale to thousands of items. But we simply delete the file, create it over again, and write it back. And that's our changes to the main view model. And one more change to the item view model to add a couple of properties, and we'll be ready to start actually looking at what the changes are to our details page. So let's open up the item view model and add these two properties. And the two properties are called Sonnet ID and isFavorite. And because we implement iNotify property change, we have to, as we do each set, call notify property change for these particular properties. So we've now taken our basic structure, we've added a class, sonnets.cs, to hold the data for our XML file. We've made some changes to the app.xaml.cs to initialize the XML file from the Shakespeare Sonnets XML on a one-time basis. And we've made changes to the main view model and the item view model in order to support two lists in the main view model and in order to support the additional properties we need for the item view model, namely the Sonnet ID and the isFavorite property. I think we're ready to go. Let's go on now and build the details page and get ready to make this app save our favorites.